Welcome to the IBS Nutrition Podcast, your go-to source for navigating the complex diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome. Here, we dive deep into IBS and discover the power of diet and lifestyle to find freedom from your IBS symptoms. I'm your host, Jessie Wong, FODMAP dietitian and a gut expert. For years, I suffered from debilitating gut symptoms that kept me out of work, feeling constant discomfort in my body and anxious around food. Today, I'm in control of my IBS, able to eat the food I love again, travel whenever I want, and spend quality time with loved ones. It is my mission to help you do the same and transform the way you live with IBS. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new season of IBS Nutrition Podcast. And today I have a very special guest with me. And the topic we're talking about today is a question I get all the time. And I can't tell you how many hundreds of times I've gotten these questions about probiotics. So let's welcome our speaker or our guest today, Bailey Hanna. Bailey is a registered dietitian with a master's degree in nutrition and dietetics from Loma Linda University. She specializes in IBS and digestive health and is the founder of IBSprobiotics.org, a completely brand new resource designed to cut through the marketing noise and deliver evidence-based answers about probiotics use in IBS. Oh my God. Hi, Bailey. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so happy to be here.
I am so glad that you agreed to join us because there is just so much noise in the probiotic space. Everybody's promising something. But then when we look at the research, there's a huge gap in there. And I'm so glad you are here to talk all about that. It can really help people cut through the noise and maybe not waste money or maybe sacrifice, like maybe get hurt sometimes by these products. So let's just get started. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is a probiotics?
So by definition, a probiotic is a live microorganism that when administered in adequate amounts provides a health benefit to the host, which would be us. So basically a microorganism that is defined and it is alive and it has evidence of benefits, ideally from something like a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So that's kind of the gist. There's a lot of confusion, I think, that people have about what exactly qualifies as a probiotic. You'll often hear someone saying, oh, I had some kimchi and that had probiotics. Not exactly. That would provide you with some live and active cultures and different microbes, but they're not defined. So probiotics have to be very defined and we have to know exactly what we're taking.
Okay. Now, there are two other terms that's very similar to probiotics. If you can kind of explain it before we go into more depth about the research, that would be great. One is prebiotics and the other one is synbiotics. Oh, actually, I guess synbiotics is something we hear all the time too, and postbiotics.
Yes. So a prebiotic is, you can think of it as kind of like the food for the microbes that you already have in your gut. So they help to support selectively certain beneficial microbes, help those to proliferate. Whereas a synbiotic is kind of a combination where you take both a probiotic and a prebiotic and you put it together. And there's two types of synbiotics. So you can have complementary synbiotics where you have a probiotic and prebiotic that kind of work independently. So the prebiotic is just supporting your native gut microbes, or you can have a synergistic symbiotic where you have a very specially chosen prebiotic that the probiotic that you're taking feeds off of. So that's kind of like a little bit of background there. As for postbiotics, so I think there's a lot of confusion about this term, actually. So I believe the latest ISAP definition defines postbiotics as inanimate microbes. So basically microbes that maybe previously were kind of a probiotic in nature, but they have been deactivated. And postbiotics can also include metabolites of these inanimate microbes, but that is not actually required. It can just be the dead microbe, but it can also include other things like metabolites that probiotics create, like short chain fatty acids, those sorts of things. And I think a lot of confusion happens there because people believe that the postbiotics are the short chain fatty acids and other metabolites, but that's actually not the case. Those don't have to be there, but they can be included.
Okay, awesome. And you mentioned ISAP. I want to clarify for everybody listening that is the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics. So they are doing the bulk of the research or analyzing the bulk of research for us and sharing with us the information. That is awesome. Thank you for clearing up the space. Now, we hear a lot, and we use that term a lot as well in our practice, and that is strain specific probiotics for symptoms. Can you talk a little bit about what a strain is? How do we identify a probiotic strain? Because we see a lot of the time, say, a bottle saying lactobacillus, but it doesn't have something else after that. Is that a strain?
No, not quite. So I think a really good analogy to use here, it would be like if you were saying, okay, I want to get a dog and just classify dogs in a broad sense, right? But if you start thinking about different types of dogs, there's clearly a very different, clearly there's a major difference between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, and maybe the kind of lifestyle activities you would engage with either of these types of dogs, right? So you have to think of probiotics the same way. They have very specific kind of niche indications, and very specific strains do specific things. And so you probably don't want to get the Chihuahua if you're looking for a running partner. Same way, if you're looking for a probiotic that's going to help you with bloating, you're going to want to find a strain that's like very specific to that. And so the way you can identify this is in the name. So here's an example of a probiotic that is listed out to the strain level: Bacillus coagulans unique IS2. So Bacillus coagulans, once I've said that much, I have identified that probiotic at the species level. But the last part, I said unique IS2, that third segment, that is the strain level. And usually it's going to be like a combination of letters or numbers, or another one would be like Bacillus coagulans MTCC 5856. The MTCC 5856 is kind of what designates it at the strain level. There are some rare instances where we can still achieve benefits at the species level. We mostly see that for like probiotics found in certain fermented dairy products like yogurts. We know that there are some species levels effects when it comes to helping break down lactose and possibly helping with lactose intolerance. But that's kind of rare and more of the exception. When you are looking into a probiotic that you're like, if you're looking for a supplement, you're definitely going to want species level identification.
Species level, not no.
Or sorry, strain.
Strain level. Right?
Let me correct myself there. Strain level, not species level. Yes, right. Strain level identification. Yeah.
Right. Looking for the. So I like to simplify a little bit for our listeners. So if you are looking for a strain, you will see most likely the first name, the middle name, and the last name on a bottle when you are buying a probiotics for a probiotic strain. If you don't see the last part of the last name, which includes usually maybe a name with a number or alphabetical letters with numbers, then you're not buying the strain. And my understanding, sometimes companies don't put the strains in the bottle is because if they can't source the strain, they're going to switch it out for a different strain, and it would still be the same genus and species, but then it would be a different strain. Is that correct?
I mean, I would say it's very possible. It's also hard to identify products at the strain level. Like if you come up with some kind of everything but the kitchen sink kind of blend, which you see a lot of out there, which we'll talk about that soon, why you probably don't want to go for that. But what's really tricky is, we don't have great assays to actually clarify these products down to the strain level. So I think they do that maybe so that they can kind of cover themselves so they don't actually have to prove what something is down to the strain level. But the problem with that is that you as the consumer now have no idea what these strains are or if there is any evidence tied to those strains for particular benefits you might be looking to achieve. And so it works on their behalf because they likely can't prove down to the strain level what's in their product given the testing options we have available to us. But it really does not work on the behalf of consumers because now you just don't know.
Yeah. Oh, well, now you brought up research. That would be our next topic. And I think people really want to learn about it. What is the state of research when it comes to probiotics? What are the evidence? What is also the quality, quantity, and regulation? We'll go through one at a time.
So when it comes to my understanding of, evidence quality for probiotics, I can mostly speak towards what I know in the realm of IBS. That's the area that I'm most familiar with. And I would say that it varies depending on the specific product and the study design and what all went into that. There are some studies that, have decent design whereas there's other studies that just really I would not trust. I would not take any clinical sort of takeaways from those results because of the study design. I would say overall, there have been a lot of studies done on different probiotics in IBS, but it's not like there's any one single probiotic that's ever been studied to the level that you see for like a drug trial, right? Where you have multiple phase trials. So we have some soft evidence that shows a potential benefit here and there, not consistently across the board for all probiotics, but here and there, where maybe a probiotic could be considered. But there are a lot of pitfalls to that research that we have to be aware of as well. A lot of this is industry funded. That doesn't mean that we automatically discredit the results, because if the industry was not funding these things, we probably just wouldn't have any data. But, we do have to be careful and really pay attention to their methods and what they've done to ensure that we are trusting the results that they're presenting to us. And a lot of these studies are also fairly small. There's an exception here and there with 300 plus participant studies, but we have to recognize that we have kind of smaller population sizes that a lot of this evidence is coming from. So it's a mixed bag. Here and there you see something that can allow us to have cautious optimism, but we should not conflate that as top tier evidence surpassing other therapies that have a little bit more backing, like diet therapies. And so it's just helpful to contextualize where we are.
I'm going to pause you here a little bit. I don't know if I said it earlier. We are going to, Bailey specifically will be giving out recommendations for IBS patients later on, but we do want to lay out, the groundwork of understanding for probiotics first, so that you have a better understanding. But later on, Bailey is going to share a 5-step recommendations for IBS patients so that you can pick the right strain or work with your provider to choose the right thing for your right condition or the symptoms that you want to work on. Okay, let's keep talking. Yeah, because I think this is getting a bit deeper, and I think people don't hear enough about this. A lot of the times we are just bashed with the marketing, right? With the advertisement, with endorsement from influencers, which beware, not everybody's speaking the truth. And of course, they're paid to say good things. They're not going to say the bad things. And that's something we will talk about in the research realm as well. Well, actually, since we're talking about it, let's talk about this, because there are research about different strains of probiotics, and sometimes they only publish the positive results, right? They don't always publish if something doesn't go right. So we don't know if there are adverse effects sometimes that happens to it. Will you elaborate a little bit more on that?
So I think a really big pitfall for probiotic literature in general, and this is something that has been brought up many, many times, is that we need more structured adverse events monitoring in different probiotic studies. So it's a big question mark of, are we always capturing if something is going wrong? And then we also don't have a lot of long-term follow-up data. So I think that that's another thing to keep in mind about evidence quality and the literature. There are still things that we don't know. And hopefully we'll start seeing more guidance on how to better structure probiotic clinical trials to capture some of that and to monitor things over the long term so that we can start filling those knowledge gaps.
That's amazing. Okay. So we're still talking about quality of the research. What about the quantity? I think you also mentioned length of the research, right? Most of the research are pretty short term. Will you talk more about that? And what is the long-term implication for us as a general population?
I would say, like most of the studies that I've encountered that are randomized placebo-controlled trials of probiotics and IBS, which was my focus when putting together the resource we'll talk about here soon, those studies would vary in duration from anywhere from 4 weeks to 6 months, and it was kind of all over the map. But I think for the most part, we only have kind of short-term data, so we don't really know what happens beyond certain time points. If somebody can reach a plateau effect where maybe they achieved initial benefits, and do those dissipate? Do they persist? How long can they persist after you stop? One of the cool things that I learned while going through a lot of the literature was that there were some cases where a probiotics effects would have a carryover effect for maybe 10 or so days, but then we didn't have any more data beyond that. And I think that would be really interesting from an administration standpoint of knowing, okay, how often do I need to take this? And can I take breaks and maintain benefits? How long can I maintain those benefits? But I think when we don't have long-term data, it kind of creates pitfalls with, just the unknown, right? Not knowing where things might go in the future or what certain risks or benefits might be. And also if there's a way to sustain some of those benefits. So hopefully that will be something we see in the future, that, we start paying more attention to longer term studies and kind of surveillance efforts to see what happens over the long run.
Okay. So how long are usually the studies right now? Is it usually 4 weeks, 8 weeks? Do you see anything longer than that?
I feel like 8 to 12 weeks is more standard. I mean, here and there, like you'll have the shorter 4-week studies, but I think 8 weeks is probably the most standard. But I've seen up to 6 months. That was like one of the longer trials.
Okay, but there are very few studies that would go to
beyond that, at least in IBS.
It's a lot of money, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the biggest myths I hear on social media, on TV, everywhere, or even from friends and family is that you need to take a probiotics to improve your gut health. What is your take on that, especially after reviewing all the research studies?
I think there is absolutely no evidence that someone needs to take a probiotic for general gut health purposes. I think if you want to take a probiotic, you need to be taking it for a very specific reason, like, bloating, for example, or constipation. You have to have something very specific in mind that you want to address, because, otherwise you could, if you're looking for general gut health, I think you should go for general interventions, right? Like a general, like healthy, higher fiber diet, maybe incorporating some fermented foods. Go for those types of strategies and put your money and resources and time into working on that. And just remember that probiotics are for specifics. So don't fall for any kind of marketing hype that's pushing this whole gut health narrative on you. What does that even mean? I think we need to ask, what does that mean? In what context? And clarify what that means for you before you consider a probiotic.
I love that. And when we talk about gut health foundation, right, we're really talking about getting enough fiber. And we know per research, 90% of Americans are not getting enough fiber daily, right? And we're talking about 25 grams to 35 grams, depending on body size, depending on your own gut. And that is a lot of fiber every single day. 90% of people in America are not getting enough fiber. So that's number one thing to work on. And then also, eat more variety. It's not just shoving fiber supplements down your gut, right? You really want more diverse fiber into your gut and feeding different kinds of microbiome in there and help them thrive. If you only eat one type of fiber source, then you're really only feeding one group of microbes. So the basics, the foundation is really hitting your fiber goal and eating a wide variety of diets, feeding your gut microbiome. And also sleep, stress, drinking enough fluids, moving your body, like all those things that really helps improve gut health and general health. There's just no magic wand here with a probiotics, or at least not that we know yet, that can actually improve gut health or gut function. Oh, I love this. And I love what you're saying. And research is limited. Quality can vary greatly. There's a lot of quantities out there, right? What would you say, looking at all the IBS research in there, what would you say is the percentage of a high quality research versus, or maybe, you know what, give us an example of a bad quality research. For those of you listening, if you don't follow Bailey, you need to follow her on Instagram or TikTok. It's Bailey Hanna RD. She shares the most hilarious videos about probiotics trial. I'm gonna let Bailey speak here about some of the interesting research and why they are not validated.
Yes. So I think a while back I had done a reel about this one study that I came across while putting everything together. And basically, this study, they had used a tool to measure symptoms of people with IBS to see if the probiotic improved IBS symptoms. But the problem was they added a lot of parameters to this tool that had never been part of the tool when it was actually validated and shown to work. And so they were adding in, like mood symptoms for like a digestive symptom frequency questionnaire. And, maybe that's not a great idea, especially when we have a lot of other different types of tools that we can use that are validated for assessing those types of things. And I guess just doing it in a way where they were creating a study that, if you weren't quite sure what was going on, it would probably look like this probiotic was very impressive and had these broad spectrum effects, but it was a lot of data manipulation happening. And, it kind of takes knowing a little bit about these things, knowing about the tools that they're using, what they're supposed to look like, and then understanding how they've kind of just eliminated validity of these tools that they're using to create these results. Or like, I'm trying to think, there were so many things wrong with this one study that I was thinking of. There was another separate incident where I was looking over a study and noticed that there were no inferential statistics. And by that, I mean, like, typically when you're reading through a study, you'll see things like a p-value, which is telling us that there's a difference from an intervention compared to a placebo group. And it looks like a 0.0005 or whatever, like it's a 0.00, whatever, it's that kind of number. So there would be times where like these stats would be totally missing, and they would report data without any form of statistics, just kind of like, oh, there was a percentage improvement. And then upon closer inspection by a statistician that I worked with on this resource I'm telling you about soon, it was kind of this realization that like all of these things that they said were significant effects, when we actually ran the stats ourselves, they were not significant effects. And so sometimes it's not something you're going to be able to spot just by reading a study. Sometimes it actually takes a very thorough analysis. And that's what's so scary, when you have research out there that has been constructed to create marketing materials, but that doesn't have any sort of quality to it. And so that's one of the things on ibsprobiotics.org that we focused a lot on, creating an evidence grading structure and system for ranking probiotic studies so that people can understand that, if they are to try something, it comes from, evidence quality that is at whatever level, right? And we also had firm disqualifiers where some data we did not choose to give a probiotic credit for a benefit for whatever symptom it was claiming, because the evidence quality was so poor that the results were not trustworthy.
Wow. Okay. And these are the probiotics that we see in supermarkets, online, and everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends. So there are some more well-known options that had decent evidence, but then there were some that did not have great evidence. I think what gets really tricky though is that there are so many products that have no evidence, like at all, right? So many products that have just been thrown together. They have never been studied in a randomized placebo-controlled trial and shown to have any sort of benefit. It's just, whatever someone dreamed up in their own mind. And I didn't even touch those products with the database, with the ibsprobiotics.org database, because I was exclusively looking at what actually had evidence, because that's kind of a non-starter. If we don't even have baseline level of, evidence on a probiotic, then we shouldn't even be contemplating it, because we have no idea what it's going to do.
Absolutely. Now tell us more about this tool that you've created. It's ibsprobiotics.org.
So this is basically an ad-free website that you can go to. It's totally freely available, where I've worked to collect data from randomized placebo-controlled trials of probiotics in IBS and organize that data so that you can get a better sense of which probiotics have been studied and shown promise for which specific symptoms, or not shown promise. Sometimes they had neutral effects. And then basically the goal of this resource is to facilitate better conversations with medical providers and IBS patients when discussing what the evidence is for different probiotic interventions. And another way that the website supports that goal, there's a section that also talks about the guidelines for probiotics and IBS that have been published across the globe, because there's a little bit of regional variance there. And I think it helps to understand just kind of the landscape when having these types of conversations, and not automatically going in assuming that a probiotic will be recommended.
That's great. Well, you brought up guidelines. Can you talk about what is the guideline right now in the US versus what is going on in the world? Because there are some IBS guidelines that recommends probiotics, but not all guidelines recommends probiotics, right? Can you touch a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So there are valid reasons for why guidelines, in the United States might choose to go with that more conservative stance. But then on the other hand, you have guidelines coming out of countries like Japan or Canada that do endorse the use of probiotics in IBS. And I wouldn't say that those recommendations are necessarily wrong either. There are justifications that could be made for that as well. So, like on the conservative kind of no stance, I think some of the things that you could bring up as a reason for taking that stance would be any sort of evidence quality concerns, like we were talking about before, maybe small population sizes, risk of bias, industry funded studies, those types of things. And so that's all very relevant. Also, things like dose uncertainties. Have we got enough evidence for any one particular probiotic to say, like, yes, this is it, this is something we can recommend? So that makes sense in that context. I also think that something I've observed that's kind of interesting, but maybe part of the picture, maybe not, is countries that have less regulation, as is the case with the United States, maybe have erred more on the side of a no, because you have to consider the population context in which those recommendations are being made. Maybe in countries that don't have such a reactive type of enforcement system like we have here, where we put a product onto the market and then we regulate later if there's a problem and we need to step in. And that's assuming we have enough, resources to actually pull that off. Other countries don't take that approach and regulate in advance before a product hits the consumer. And so, it kind of makes sense how other countries that have regulatory steps in place to catch problems before they happen, to regulate language around what a product can be used for before it's given to the consumer, how they maybe would be a little bit more open to the option of a probiotic in IBS. Because when you look at the data, yes, there are evidence quality concerns as a whole, but here and there are some options that have shown some promise. And I think the case that one could make for a yes stance is that we're definitely always in need of additional therapies in IBS. I think sometimes we get to a point where we've made it as far as we can with the options that we have available. And nobody would ever want to say no to additional therapeutic options if there's something that could potentially be helpful. So I think that would be the kind of case for a yes, but that is not the case in the United States with our current guidelines.
I love that. And that really explains why we don't really recommend it in here. Now, that brings us to probably our last point. What is your recommendations for IBS patients, especially the ones in the United States?
So I guess my recommendation would be, first and foremost, I think probiotics, given that we don't have a unanimous consensus from all guidelines, I would likely look more towards other interventions first that we are a little bit more unanimous about. For example, like diet interventions. I think probiotics could be something to consider if you have exhausted other options that have a little bit more validation and consistent recommendations, and you're still kind of not quite where you were hoping to be with symptom management. I think it's reasonable at that point to consider a probiotic with your medical provider, because you've already followed the guidelines at that point, right? You've already taken the steps and maybe you're looking for some additional options. But I think that if you're going to do that, you need to do that in a very structured way. So for one, you need to ensure that you're a good candidate for a probiotic. And I think you do that with your medical provider, who can walk you through and see what you've tried, what you may want to consider trying still. You need to make sure that there may not be any specific safety issues for you on a personal level. For example, if you're someone who's immunocompromised, you really want to talk with your physician about that before you try a probiotic. That's not to say that it's totally off the table, but that would be a situation where you would want physician approval and monitoring if you were going to go that route. There are some rare instances where patients who are critically ill or immunocompromised taking a probiotic have run into issues like a bloodstream infection from a probiotic, for example. Very rare, but it can happen. So make sure you're a candidate. And another thing, like we were talking about before, to be a candidate for a probiotic, you have to have a specific need that you're trying to address. It should not be I'm looking for general gut health, right? General gut health, we seek out general broad kind of interventions that we should all be aiming for anyway, right? Just like getting the basics down. Probiotics are for specifics. And then I think from there, if you've determined that, if you alongside your provider have determined that maybe a probiotic is an option to consider, I think what's very, very important, and what the resource I've put together aims to do, is you need to match higher quality evidence of the evidence that we have out there with your specific symptom needs. And by that, I mean you need to find research that is a randomized placebo-controlled trial, must be placebo-controlled due to the high placebo response rate in IBS. And it needs to show that a probiotic has shown promise for the specific symptoms that you are looking to address. And you also need to find other details within that research regarding the dose, the form, and the duration that a probiotic was taken. And that is going to form the basis for any kind of probiotic trial. So the website that I've put together, ibsprobiotics.org, essentially organizes that information in a way that it's easier to find, so you don't have to sort as much, and also has some additional stuff that we can talk about in a bit to help with decision making related to that.
I'm just looking on your website now, and I'm seeing how many strains or brands have been disqualified. That's eye-opening. That tells us, the state of research. Really, a lot of the research out there, even very recognized or national, international brand names, they may not actually have the research to back it up. But what they usually have when they are internationally recognized is a very strong marketing budget. Would you agree?
I would say that's a big part of it. And funny enough, like the whole basis for me creating this resource was, I had worked with this one student intern that I was a preceptor for, and she had very severe IBS and had exhausted a lot of options, and she wanted to try a probiotic. And she asked me for my opinion. And I was like, honestly, I find it all confusing. Guidelines are all over the place. And I told her, I've heard that this probiotic has been studied in IBS, so maybe that's a place to start. And she tried it, and surprise, surprise, nothing changed, no benefits. And when I dug into it a little bit more, I realized, okay, the evidence quality was really not that great. And the studies do not suggest that the probiotic actually would have addressed the specific symptoms that she was struggling with. And I realized that even for myself as a clinician, I had just made a recommendation based more off of marketing hype than off of actual evidence. And it just totally lit this fire in me and made it to where, I was starting to collect all of these different spreadsheets for myself where I'm organizing like, okay, this probiotic did this and this one did this, and then bringing in a statistician later to help me organize that even further to see like, okay, were these effects truly seen if we look at it and recalculate their stats, and, which effects were strongest. So that's kind of the basis of what the tool does. And it all started because I, as an IBS dietitian, a clinician, was duped by marketing hype. So, I think it's pervasive. It impacts all of us. It kind of gets into our psyche. And if we really want to, spend our money wisely and not fall prey to that, we have to look at things a little bit more critically. And it takes time to do that. And so that's why, I work to put together that resource.
I really appreciate you putting this resource together. I think we were still talking about the 5 considerations for IBS patients, but I also want to maybe jump in and kind of share a client story real quick about misuse of probiotics. Is that you have, for any patients listening, you have to find the right strain that matches what your symptoms are. And actually, one of our previous clients who came to us for significant diarrhea, she went to a different dietitian. She went to her doctors. They actually recommended her and probiotics that have evidence for IBS. However, that probiotic strain had evidence for constipation. And for her, she struggled with diarrhea. So it did nothing for her, and it potentially actually made her diarrhea worse. So, usually the first recommendation as a clinician in IBS, and we see a lot of patients, is stop everything you're taking. Let's see, because sometimes the probiotics or even the medication could be the reason why you are having all these symptoms. And we see this all the times. Now, I'm going to give you the mic again. So let's walk through that 5 key considerations you have for IBS patients.
Yes, and I love that example you shared. I feel like that illustrates so perfectly how important it is to take this kind of like symptom specific approach. But I guess like the third step comes down to, you know, like after you've done all of your due diligence and you've actually been able to find something that has shown promise for these specific symptoms you're looking to manage, you then are in this position where you need to find a reputable product, right? You can't just go and take anything, again, especially in the United States with our regulatory framework. So some of the things, like there are a lot of considerations when it comes to finding a reputable commercial product. I think the most important one, though, is you want to find a product that has independent third-party testing and verification for three things: purity, so to know that there are not any contaminants; potency, you want to make sure that the dose that's, you know, stated on the bottle is actually in there and that it will be, you know, at an appropriate dose through till expiration. And then identity, you want strain level identification confirmed through this independent testing. I think
third-party testing to
third-party
confirm
testing
the strain, because otherwise we as consumers would not know what's actually in the bottle, right?
Right. And this is actually one of the areas where most commercial probiotics get disqualified. Most companies, if they have not put their products together very thoughtfully, and they've done the whole like kitchen sink sort of blend, are not going to have an easy time actually verifying down to the strain level that a product is, you know, containing the strains that they claim, because we just do not have sensitive enough testing to do that. You know, also if you have this mix that has bifidobacterium and lactobacillus, like all of these different things grow on different types of assays. So how are you going to measure all of these things all together and actually prove viability very easily of all of these specific strains? So less is more, I would say. If you're going to take a blend that's especially like a mega blend, right? You want it to be one that's actually been validated in research independently so that you can have an idea of what to expect. Because if you're trying to piece together, you know, the effects of a 16 strain probiotic where, okay, sure, maybe some of these strains have been studied here and there at these doses, and we're just going to throw them all together and see what happens. We don't really have we have no evidence that that's actually going to work. And again, we're not going to be able to verify what's actually in that product given the limitations of current testing methods. So I think that's a really big landmine. Another huge landmine to keep in mind for people who have IBS is other ingredients that are put into the probiotic. So you just want to be careful with that. And this doesn't apply across the board because people have different levels of tolerance to different things. So sometimes someone maybe can tolerate a little bit of inulin just fine and it's not a disqualifier. But for someone that's very inulin sensitive, you're going to want to be mindful of added prebiotics or added sugar alcohols in gummies. Gummies are the worst offenders. You know, you don't really want to take something that's increasing all of these variables with like, you know, different prebiotics and sugar alcohols and stuff, especially in IBS, because now you're not going to be able to easily disentangle the effects of the probiotic from potential side effects of the ingredients in the probiotic. And I think the other like major landmine that I would just call to people's attention, I feel like, you know, the human psyche, we think that if there's a lot of things listed on a label that maybe we're getting added value, you know, like all of these different kind of cool sounding herbs and polyphenols. And I just want to offer a word of caution about that and kind of like restructure our way of thinking of this. So I was chatting with a lady that does independent third-party verification for probiotic companies. And she told me this horror story where a probiotic company was trying to create a synergistic beneficial kind of blend, and they added in a polyphenol with their probiotic. And sadly, that polyphenol just so happened to have antimicrobial effects and killed the entire batch of probiotics. And this is such a disaster because they probably paid like minimum order quantity of 15 grand to produce this batch of probiotics, and it's useless. And who knows, like, I don't know who the company was or what happened after that, or if that product got sold. But now every single time I see, these like mega lists of all of these different herbs that are probably not even dosed in a way that they would even do anything, I don't feel more confident in that product. I feel like there have been some added variables that I'm a bit more concerned about. So a
that
thoughtful
could
formulator.
destabilize the formula, right? Now,
Right.
this is a really important point. I just kind of want to recap it for everybody listening. So you are talking about this third-party testing company who tested the product and found out the product doesn't have any life culture in it. So they found this because it was third-party tested. And most of the
Right.
products out there are not third-party tested. So we have really no idea what's going on in a bottle. That's
Right.
what you are saying. And it's so important to find a third-party testing company or to find a product that has been third-party tested. Now, big question for you here. What are we looking for when we're looking for a third-party testing company? Do they have a label on a bottle? What will it say?
I mean, sometimes there are labels. For example, like USP is sort of the gold standard. NSF, I think, is another one. There are so many different ones, but I think one thing to keep in mind is USP certification. It's a very expensive certification. So it's usually going to be reserved for like very, very large companies that can pay, $60,000 or whatever it may be to get that verification. So I would say at a bare minimum, the company needs to be able to provide evidence of purity, potency, and identity through an independent report. Whether they have that extra step or not, like that would be ideal. You may not always encounter it, but at a bare minimum, there needs to be evidence that they have looked for purity, potency, and identity.
But how would we as consumer know? Because we can't trust what's put on the bottle, right? Unless we see a seal or a label. And I mean, we still want to confirm it, but yeah.
So they should be able to produce the reports from an independent lab that is not from them, from like Soros lab or whatever it may be. They should be able to produce independent results.
And we can't perhaps go on the website of a probiotics and look for that report. And if they are legitimate, they will put that report somewhere on their website, right?
Yes. Now, another thing, so there is kind of like this companion embedded site on ibsprobiotics.org called probioticfinder.org. We kind of separated it a bit from the original resource because we wanted any brand specific information to be away from a lot of the data. And also because a lot of the different brands that may contain different probiotics, those probiotic strains can be present in more than one brand. So if you go on some of the individual pages on ibsprobiotics.org, there is a button you can click to view that resource. And so that website has kind of a collection of different probiotics that we found that met certain criteria for showing, different beneficial effects in IBS populations, and organizes probiotics that contain different strains that were studied based off of, do they have additional irritants and things that may trigger symptoms? Do they have like a transparent formula where all of the CFU dosing information is clear? Are they including all of these excess strains that have never been studied in IBS? Do they have third-party independent verification posted on their website? So like all of that has kind of been collected in that one space to help with the clarifying different companies that have checked certain boxes. But again, I feel like this is a great thing to navigate with a medical provider to ensure that you're still arriving at options that are more suited to your needs if you are someone who is a candidate for a probiotic.
Right. Yes, let's go back to the 5 consideration, right? So the first consideration is to confirm that you are a candidate, clarify your therapeutic goals. Second is finding a high quality evidence strain or brand that is specific to the patient's need. And the third would be finding a reputable commercial products, right? You wrote here, avoiding probiotic landmines, and you've already shared a lot of landmine with us. Yes. Okay, step 4 and 5. You want to go through that?
Sure. So I think the fourth step, you've gotten to the point where you've found a product that you want to try. Now you need to be thoughtful with how you're going to go about that. So I think one of the most important things is to really be careful to isolate your variables. I think it gets really tricky if someone, starts a low FODMAP diet and they're starting a probiotic. Now we have different variables that are maybe like interacting at once, and we're not getting a very clear picture of how any one intervention is working. So I would say take a probiotic in isolation so you can do this experiment and see how it works specifically for you. Additionally, I think the biggest question I always get when it comes to how to take a probiotic is, just like specifics related to that. Should you take it with food, without food, in the morning, in the evening, more than once a day, all of these kinds of things. And I think we have drastically overcomplicated this question. So how you take a probiotic, or the best way to take a probiotic, there is not one singular answer, because that would be assuming that all probiotics have the same sort of survivability and, the same kinds of like dosing mechanisms needed, same place in the GI tract where they're active. So the best way to take a probiotic is, for one, according to the dose that has been studied, but for two, according to manufacturer instructions. Because if you are taking a reputable product, then the formulator should have done all of the mental gymnastics for you in advance. And that's your cue to kind of just breathe a sigh of relief and say, all right, they say I can take it with or without food in the morning. That's that, right? And just go with it. So that is step 4. Thoughtful application.
That's really good to know. Yes. Yeah. And that is one question that we get all the time. When do I take it? Do I take it with food? Not with food. Yeah. Okay. Follow the manufacturer instruction.
Yeah. They've already figured it all out for you. And then the 5th thing is, okay, so you've taken a probiotic. You've got to evaluate and monitor your personal response to that. So one of the things that we should have identified, all the way back at like step 2 is duration. How long was a probiotic taken in a clinical trial before a benefit was achieved that we're personally looking to benefit or personally looking to achieve? So when you go into a probiotic trial, you need to have guardrails already in place. If I'm taking a probiotic where the evidence has shown that benefits were achieved within 8 weeks, that's my cutoff to reassess, right? So I'm going to try it and see if I achieve the benefit I'm going for by 8 weeks. And if I haven't, I'm going to stop taking it, because there is no point in taking a probiotic that is not actually helping us. The other thing too, we want to be mindful that probiotics do take a little bit of time to work. It's not going to be a right away kind of thing. There can be some time, especially in the first 1 to 2 weeks, where things might be a little bit different, a little dicey, maybe a little bit more bloated, loose stools during an adaptation period. That doesn't always happen, but on occasion that can be like a thing that happens as a result of trying a new probiotic. I would say, like if it's tolerable, it's okay to sit with that for up to 2 weeks. But if you're still experiencing that after 2 weeks, I would stop. I would personally stop, because I feel like at that point, it's maybe just not a good fit for you. And it is never normal to have severe abdominal pain, severe worsening of GI symptoms. If ever you are at a point where you're just having these like really severe reactions to a probiotic, it's just maybe not the right fit for you. And something I always like to tell people is that, no matter what you've read about a probiotic, no matter how promising it sounds, no matter, how alluring the marketing may be, every single probiotic clinical trial I have read had responders and non-responders. And sometimes we're just not responders, right? So it's like the final test is always going to be your symptom experience, not what someone else told you, and not, just whatever research or hype might be behind the product. You really just get in touch with how you respond and trust that.
Absolutely. Oh my God, this is so good. Wow, Bailey, thank you so much for your time. Well, for every episode we have, I actually like to share maybe a feel good story as well. And this one could be related to probiotics. And I love that you are talking about these 5 valid points, because most people do not think through it before they try something. And one of my clients, I know there's not a whole lot of studies about probiotics and SIBO, but one of our previous clients who came to us, he had nonstop diarrhea. He was losing weight, lost about 30 to 40 pounds. He went to his PCP. PCP sent him to us. And we talked, we kind of work out on a diet and lifestyle kind of aspect, right? But we also dive deeper to find out what is really going on. He didn't quite like that area. He went to a different practitioner, actually did a lot of tests. One of those tests that have no evidence that it actually helps IBS, and was prescribed a ton of supplements. He was giving himself B12 shots at one point. So when things didn't get better, he came back and we looked at what's going on. And the first thing I found was that he was taking a probiotics, and the probiotics was actually giving him the non-stop diarrhea. And these are the side effects that we're not seeing being captured in research. But we actually see that all the time in clinic, which is why our first recommendation is always please stop everything you're taking, especially a probiotics.
Right.
And what happened was when we then sent him back to his PCP and also sent him to a GI as well to get further evaluation, what we suspected was that he had SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Well, I shouldn't say there's not a whole lot of research. We know there are research suggesting that taking probiotics of certain kind, right, can put people at higher risk of having SIBO. And that's exactly what happened to him. And once we got his SIBO treated, his diarrhea stopped. He was on the low FODMAP diet because he lost weight. He had a really, really sensitive gut at that point. But good thing is everything was fine. He went back to the GI, got all the tests done. Everything was fine. And we were able to reintroduce all the FODMAPs without any issue. Toward the end of working together, this is like a 6-month project for us. Like this is a very severe case of IBS, obviously. Toward the end, he actually reverted back to more constipation. And I asked him, did you have constipation to begin with? And he was thinking back, right? Why did he start taking the probiotics? The reason was he had some bloating. And now, after working together, we know exactly what caused the bloating. The bloating was caused by constipation. And he took some probiotics recommended by some friends to resolve the bloating. And it ended up giving him significant diarrhea and causing significant weight loss as well. So, like what you were saying, there are some research, but most of them do not have research, especially in the US market. There's not a whole lot of regulation about this, and be very, very careful.
I think that's such a great cautionary tale. And it also kind of goes back to what we were talking about in step 1, where you really want to confirm with your medical provider if you are a good candidate. And part of that confirmation process would be your medical provider looking to see, okay, have we exhausted other steps that might be a better first step before we bring in a probiotic or even consider that as a therapeutic intervention? Because it sounds like he kind of ended up working in reverse, right? And not arriving at what was going to be most therapeutic and helpful for him on an individual level through a probiotic on top as a Band-Aid and hope for the best. And it didn't go well. And I think that that's a really, a great cautionary tale of how not to use probiotics. You need to get some other foundational things down first. And that's when you can start contemplating and working with a medical provider to see if you're a good candidate. And you may not be a good candidate for one. And another thing that you pointed out that I think is so, so important, he got all of these tests, right? And was like doing all of these types of interventions. I think there's such a pull right now towards people trying these direct to consumer microbiome tests. And I get it. We all want to take a test that tells us take this and then you're going to feel better. But I think we need to be very, very careful with that because there is just no good evidence that those tests actually result in beneficial outcomes if we're using them in a prognostic kind of way.
So for anyone who wants to learn more about these tests, we actually had an episode with Dr. Andrea Love talking about tests that you probably don't need for IBS and why they are a red flag. So gut microbiome testing, food sensitivity tests, and then also some breath tests. We talked a lot about that. So if you want to go listen to it, it is episode 6 of the IBS Nutrition Podcast. It is so important because we see people spending thousands of dollars on these tests, supplements, and sometimes very restrictive regimens, especially when it comes to the food sensitivity test. Everything you eat will come back positive, and providers will tell you to cut out everything. And that's exactly what happened to this client as well. He came to me and was like, I don't know what I can eat because everything, they say I can't eat anything. And I said, just throw that thing away. Don't look at it again. Don't make yourself afraid of the food you love. So, and he did not have any food intolerances. It all really just started with mild bloating and that probiotics. So, yeah.
Goodness gracious. Yeah. It's so important to get the key things down and not go into those sort of like unproven, non-validated testing options, because it can really get you into a bad place. On that note, there was actually a study recently where a microbiome testing company tried to do sort of like prescriptive microbiome testing in IBS to give probiotics to, a different population. And the results from that I found very fascinating, but not in a great way for them. So there was this company, they prescribed probiotics according to microbiome testing, and they claimed that there was a benefit in IBS. But then I looked at the results, and it was a synbiotic combination, I think, that they were offering. So the study had no placebo control. So we don't really know, for starters, like how this intervention would have compared had they given people placebo. But the thing that got me really just kind of like perplexed, they use this symptom monitoring tool called the IBS symptom severity score, very commonly used in IBS clinical trials. And I'm very familiar with this tool. And they claimed that they achieved a benefit. But when I actually looked, so the people in this study, I think the overall average point improvement on this scale, this IBS symptom severity scale, which is normally like a 500-point scale, was by 38 points. Now, maybe that sounds great, but it's not. And here's why: because we've had validation testing done on this tool, both in 1997 and in 2016. And we have an idea of the minimum point improvement that you need to see on this tool for it to actually be clinically meaningful. And that range is between like 50 to 95 points. We've gotten slightly different results every time we've validated this tool. So they had a 38-point improvement. This is what would be on par, if not potentially even worse, than a placebo. Now, on the other hand, there are probiotic studies in the database that use this exact same tool. There was one in particular that was one of the higher quality studies that achieved a 145-point reduction on the IBS symptom severity score. And they did no microbiome testing in advance. So until these companies are able to show and prove that they can beat out just an empiric trial where you just take it and see what happens based off of, symptom-specific evidence that already exists, we can't use this information for anything to tell someone what to do. Like, we should not be using this in any sort of interventional context. Like, really, I think it should be reserved for research context right now, given where we are. So just know that the evidence isn't there. And if it was, they would be able to prove that what they're doing is superior to empiric trials. And they haven't done that yet.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Again, it just tells us that having things being researched and being promoted because they have research doesn't mean the research was good quality or have evidence that it actually worked. So it's always important to talk to your provider, and maybe a provider that understands what they are doing and understands where to look for the evidence, and have a guide like what Bailey has, the ibsprobiotics.org charts to help guide clinical decisions when you're working with your provider. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Bailey. This is extremely helpful because there's just so much confusion out there when it comes to probiotics, and some of them are so expensive, and we know more money doesn't mean they work better.
So true. And thank you for having me. I'm so happy that I've been able to be here and talk about this. But yeah, you're right. It's just because you've paid a lot for something does not necessarily mean it's going to be effective for you. It's so important to really isolate what's going to have the most potential to help, and then allow yourself to sort out, okay, did it actually help me? Did it actually improve those symptoms? And kind of fall back on that as, the final thing that determines, if it was actually worthwhile for you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for tuning into the IBS Nutrition Podcast. We hope today's episode has brought you closer to understanding and managing IBS. Remember, you are not alone on this journey, and finding freedom is possible. For more on IBS, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platforms, and please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate that. You can access links mentioned in this episode in the show notes to learn more about your type of IBS and how to identify your own food or lifestyle triggers. Register for our free IBS Masterclass, 3 Steps to IBS Relief, for our proven holistic 3-steps approach to managing IBS once and for all. Head to ibsdietitian.com/masterclass to register. Until next time, take good care of your gut, and here's to your health and happiness.